Hey everyone. This isn't really an episode. This is just a topic of discussion that came to me while I was reading a few screenplays and also writing a few short stories for Wattpad. A lot of people understand the art of dialogue when it comes to recording, when it comes to writing, and dialogue's very hard to master. Not very many people can say, oh, I have dialogue down to a pat, whether that's a story, a screenplay, a movie, TV show, whatever. When I watch movies, I like to analyze the dialogue. The dialogue is one of the most important things to me. So when I'm listening to, let's say I'm listening to an audiobook, and let's say it's a Colleen Hoover audiobook from one of her books, and I'm just like, this dialogue is terrible. Like, it's god-awful. Dialogue is an important thing. Dialogue can make or break a story, in my opinion. And if dialogue is cheesy, I will probably not listen to anything you have to say. Any movie can be turned off by dialogue. It's just a very essential part of movies, novels, TV shows, anything like that. But, I was reading some old short stories that I've written in the past and also in the present. Not necessarily just that, but I've also been very much into reading screenplays from my favorite films. And after looking at the Hateful Eight screenplay, this bonus episode sort of just segment came to mind, so I wanted to discuss it with you guys. I'm sure you know of Quentin Tarantino. Big cinephile who happens to be one of the most decorative directors of all time, with classics such like Pulp Fiction, Kill Bill, and Django Unchained. With being a famous movie maker, you have to come up with some believable dialogue, and I genuinely think that Tarantino has the best dialogue. The Feet Man does it, I tell you. As I am working on releasing a novel about the greed and deception seen in the city of Las Vegas, I find myself struggling with writing believable dialogue between my cast of characters, and I think for many people, writing stories, it can be very, very difficult, including myself. In this short discussion, however, I'm going to talk about how Tarantino writes dialogue and why it captures our attention so much, how it's so good. So let's discuss. Let's talk about Tarantino. Like I said, this is going to be a very short segment. I just really wanted to talk about it because I didn't want to dedicate a 20-30 minute episode to me just rambling on about how good Tarantino's dialogue is and how to write dialogue. So, yeah. When it comes to discussing Tarantino and how he writes, you have to talk about suspense. I think Tarantino usually takes scenes throughout all of his films and uses it to show that his amazing dialogue and how it's supposed to show us suspense by narrative building is how I call it. Tarantino's best examples of building suspense with his dialogue come in two particular films of his, and I think I'm going to use Exhibit A and not Exhibit B in this episode, but I will talk about Exhibit A, as I just mentioned. In my totally professional opinion, of course, I'm just a movie buff that knows everything about cinema. I know every movie alive. I've seen it all, but in all seriousness, this is just an opinion. It's subjective. Exhibit A is the opening scene in Inglourious Bastards. The main character, or main villain, I should say, Hans Landa, is interrogating Shoshana and her family. Well, I shouldn't say Shoshana and her family. It's more of the family that is keeping Shoshana and her family protected by keeping them away from the Nazis in Nazi-occupied France. And I think Inglourious Bastards takes place in 1942? I don't know. It's around somewhere in the 40s. I'll have to go and research that, but it's the opening scene of the movie, and as Landa is slowly putting the pieces together, you get a sense of dread knowing that these are Nazi soldiers. However, Landa isn't just any Nazi soldier. He's a Jew hunter. That's literally his nickname in the film, Jew hunter. He's the movie's main antagonist, really, and the little details that are thrown in the scene make it all that much better. For example, when Hans Landa is asking one of the sisters for milk, he does so in a way that appears to be a gentlemanly manner. However, if you're really, really smart or just have a functioning brain, you can tell he's checking her pulse just to get the thrill of knowing what he's doing. He's about to kill these people. He's ruining their life in a way. He's scaring them, and he gets a thrill out of scaring whoever he's interrogating. That's a villain. Tarantino knows how to write characters. I'll tell you that, too. That's another topic for another day. And it's his occupation, so, yeah. That's just one example, however. This isn't just a review of Inglourious Bastards, though it is one of my favorite films, and I do want to review it on the podcast in the future. When I go over other Tarantino films, I've had a list of Tarantino films I want to review. Inglourious Bastards is number one on that list, following, obviously, Pulp Fiction, maybe Reservoir Dogs. It just got added to Netflix. Speaking of Reservoir Dogs, another great thing about his dialogue is the touch of realism in the car scene in Pulp Fiction when Jules and Vincent are driving. Discuss topics ranging from cheeseburgers in France, from McDonald's and Burger King, to a rumor about their boss assaulting someone for touching his wife's feet. At first glance, it's really cringy and it sounds boring, which, yeah, I get it. It is boring, but think about it. Don't we gossip? Don't we talk about these things in real life? Tarantino, using this dialogue, is adding a sense of realism to his films. A sense of, hey, these are regular people like us, and we can't really relate to them, what we're doing. I mean, Vincent and Jules in Pulp Fiction are literally hitmen. I can't relate to killing people for money, but you relate to their topics in a way. And I think that's a pretty good way to start a film. I think Pulp Fiction isn't one of my favorite films, but it is one of the best films ever made, in my opinion. And a part of Pulp Fiction being one of the best films ever made is Tarantino and his way of using realism in his scenes. Like, for example, the opening diner scene in Pulp Fiction 2. Great performance by Tim Roth. Tim Roth is a very underrated actor. And what he's talking about, obviously, we can't relate to Honey Bunny and Pumpkin, robbing banks or robbing diners, whatever they do, they're robbers. We can't relate to them robbing people, but we can relate to the activity. We can relate to the topics of discussion that they talked about in the diner scene when Pulp Fiction starts. Same thing goes for Jules and Vincent. There's some other scenes in Pulp Fiction that I'm trying to think of, but I won't talk and ramble on about it. It'll come to my mind later. I'll bring it up. But all those rumors and just gossiping, yeah, it's part of the real world. It's really genius if you think about it. Us people really get caught up in movie magic, so it's really nice to watch a Tarantino flick and has normal conversations in it, like this particular scene. And to a lesser extent, we can also feel connections to some of Tarantino's characters via dialogue. For example, as I mentioned, speaking of Reservoir Dogs, in Reservoir Dogs, Mr. Pink talks about the idea of always tipping a waitress at a diner. And as he rants, we feel a scenario popping into our heads where we didn't really think about these real-world situations in these movies that we can sometimes relate to. Tipping. We're always accustomed to tipping people at a diner because that's a nice thing to do. That's what society taught us to do. However, should we really be going out of our way to give people our money that we earn for something that, maybe they're not that good of a waitress. Sure, don't tip, whatever. But it's a nice thing to do. You're supposed to tip. So Mr. Pink is going by societal norms by saying, I don't need to tip. Why am I going to go out of my way? I'll spend money, or give money in this case, to a waitress who's going to go out of my way to go out of her way to make coffee, whatever, check up on me. But this waitress, as he says in the movie, has only filled my coffee 3 times, and we've been sitting here talking for 2 hours. I like my coffee being filled 6 times while I'm talking to someone for 2 hours. This waitress sucks. And it gets you thinking, like, wow, do I tip? Do I do that? So yeah, the connections in the real world with Tarantino films are also really cool. Tarantino has this idea. It's 2 different types of movies that Tarantino writes in his screenplays. There's the movie, which is movies like Kill Bill, True Romance, stuff like that, and realer than real world movies, which is pretty much every other of his movies, which are basically revisionist movies. Revisionist movies would be movies going to the past in certain time periods and revising what really goes on with history. A good example of Tarantino revisionist history would be Django Unchained. Another good example is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. The Hateful Eight's also a good example. And you could also consider Death Proof a little bit of one. I don't know. Those are considered his realer than real world movies, and those are great films. Like, I should watch all 9, technically 10, because Kill Bill counts as 1 movie to Tarantino, but it's really 2 movies. Watch all 10 of his films. They're all great. Some people think Tarantino is boring. I think those people are wrong. Tarantino is far from boring. And it allows you to look at these characters deeply, as I mentioned with the tipping. I don't really find great movies great because these are, balls to the wall action and little discussions between characters. Dialogue is, in a sense, it's a big essence of a movie, a great movie at that. And Tarantino is a master at dialogue because that's what he is known for. Most blockbusters don't have the eccentric dialogue that he has. He's really the only director I know that can really do that. And even if they did, it wouldn't feel as elemental as Tarantino's dialogue. So for those who write, when it comes to writing dialogue, there are 7 general unwritten rules that you have to follow. And dialogue is an unwritten rule itself, so I'm just going to go over these rules. Rule number 1, dialogue should stay on topic, and you should use dialogue as you would with actual speech. Rule number 2, opt for the speaker attribution with all said and others. Rule number 3, avoid long speeches. Rule number 4, be grammatically correct. Rule number 5, show what the characters are doing while they're talking. And finally, keep characters' speech consistent. That is rule number 6. You follow all these rules, and you could just be the next Tarantino. Probably. I don't know.